This lesson is the second in our Mixolydian series of lessons. Last lesson we talked about scale construction and some of the basic things that you can do when you use to improvise with it. This lesson we're actually getting into, we're calling this supercharging your dominant lines. We're going to get into some chord tone enclosures, some chromaticism, some of my favorite ways to actually take this Mixolydian scale and turn it into something that's a little bit more interesting to play over a dominant chord, whether you're playing in blues or funk or in rock contexts, or jazz. If you look in the video description below, you'll find links to not only the PDF that you can print for free from our website, but also the backing track that you hear me play over in this, and any of the lessons that come before this lesson in the series, whether it's the Mixolydian 1 lesson, the cage system lesson, or any of the other soloing things that we've done to this point. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about chord tone embellishments. We're going to start off with the major triad. Remember that a dominant chord is dominant because it's got a major third and a minor seventh. We talked about this in previous lessons. We're starting off with this triad because we can do some chord tone embellishment stuff that, even though it's not dominant specific, work really good in this context. The first idea is that we're going to take every chord tone and we have the option of approaching it from a half step or 1 fret below. Right? I can play a simple phrase, right? And that was all the triad except for the approach tone below the third. I could do the approach tone below the root too. So that was root, 5, approach tone, root. The approach tone, or the embellishment, all it does really is it gives us a note that's not part of the harmony, so it makes it a little bit more interesting. And then when you do go back to the chord tone, it is interesting. If we just play chord tones over everything, there's no contrast. There's nothing to create a line. And to create a line or a musical idea, you have to go away from the chord and then resolve back to it in the way that we're looking at this. There's a lot of different ways of talking about this, but this is the way that we're actually exploring right now. So you have the half step below. We also have the scale tone above. So above the root, it's a whole step. Above the third, it's a half step. Because remember the Mixolydian scale, there's a half step between those two notes. Above the fifth, we go from the sixth, that's a whole step. And that's the kind of the same idea where we're actually taking something that's not part of the chord, which creates tension, and we'll resolve back into the chord. So I went root 3, 5, then I went the half step below, and I stayed out. I went the whole step above, and then I played the fifth right there. When we do both of those, when we do the scale tone above and the chord tone below before we end on the root, that's called an enclosure. I first learned about these listening to Les Paul recording, I think. But it's actually a very common device for jazz musicians, and I use it a lot when I play more swingy or jump style blues. You'll even hear it in some of the rocket stuff that I'm playing. Another thing that you can do is you can go between that Mixolydian scale in either your minor pentatonic scale or your blues scale. The blues scale is basically just the minor pentatonic with the flat 5 added, and you'll see that in the scale diagram. What's nice about this is that we can get away with, on a dominant chord, playing something that's essentially minor and then resolving it into the Mixolydian sound. And we actually have this way of creating interest where you're creating the tension and then you're resolving it by going back to the Mixolydian scale. I do that quite a bit in the demo solo. Just like in the Mixolydian lessons that we've done in the last couple weeks, I like this idea where I can think laterally across the fretboard. All right, so I take the 2-3 scale patterns in the minor pentatonic, and I'll use those kind of as a way of moving through something and then resolving to our Mixolydian sound. All right, it just kind of falls into place when I do that. The blues scale. We actually haven't done a lesson on the blues scale on this channel. That'll be coming. It's not the most difficult sound to work with. The nice thing is that you've got this little chromatic bit here, which is a little smoother and slinkier. That works great, especially like when you resolve it to the third, or you just go right into there's the blues scale, and then back to our Mixolydian sounds. Another approach is to connect chord tones with chromatic passing tones. The first one, the easiest one to get into, is the idea that we go from the root down to the minor 7 by connecting them with the note in the middle. You can pretty much play any note you want to over a dominant chord, really over any chord. No note is really a wrong note until we get to a resting point or a resolution. So if we play all of the notes, right, and we end up framing all of those chromatic notes with, there's the root, I went up to the 5th, and I did an approach tone into the 3rd, it'll still sound like this A7 chord, even though we're playing everything in between. But if I'm playing it in A, and I just play some random notes, it doesn't work quite so well. You learn how much tension you want to get out of a note, and how long you need to spend on it to get that tension. That's kind of a lesson for another time. But that's the basic idea with the chromaticism, is that we're actually able to smooth out our lines by connecting them. But we always start and end on the notes that define the harmony. In this case, it's your dominant 7 arpeggio. Right. So the first one, we just talked about root to the minor 7. All right, so if I wanted to, there's a blues scale, and then there's that connection, or that same thing, more pentatonic stuff, or alright, just play more of the Mixolydian sound. Going from the root to the 3rd in a straight line, in order to make it fit time-wise, I mean, I could do all of that, but I kind of like skipping the first note after the root. Sometimes it helps the lines sit in time a little bit better. So that's the idea that I'm going to do. 1 and 2 and 3 and. Right. So there's the root up to the 3. I want root 5, 4, approach tone, or we're enclosing the 3rd, and then 7 down to the minor 7, or root down to the minor 7. The last one of these chromatic passing note ideas is we're going to go from the 3rd up to the 5th. Right. Actually, that sounds like Blue Monk by Thelonious Monk. But one of my favorite things is this idea. It's almost like a Charlie Parker lick, where I'm going root, and I'm approaching the 3rd from a half step below, and then from that 3rd, I'm walking chromatically up to the 5th. He'll do that sort of thing where he goes 4, 5, 3, 2. There you go. We're just connecting these ideas. The last one of these ideas is kind of, I don't think of it as truly a Mixolydian sound, but it works really good in this context. And the idea is that I'll take our major triad, going back to the chord tones, and I'll add the 4th to it. So go 4, 3, root, 5. Right. And that's a great way of actually being able to move laterally. It's a very vocal way to actually do a passage like that. I love doing it with the half step bends. But the nice thing about it is, just like with the other embellishment ideas, you've got all these notes that define the harmony, and then the 4 just gives us one note that actually provides a little bit of contrast. If you combine all of these ideas together, you start getting this thing where you have this ability to play really long lines.